So many times clients are coming in and saying, Kim, I just don't understand what's happening to me. I have been gaining weight. I'm doing all the right things. I'm eating what I used to eat. I'm working out the same way that I used to, but I can't stay out of the sugar. If that's how you're feeling today and you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, this is the right episode for you. Today, I am joined by Dr. Christina Ensman, who is a board-certified gynecologist and a menopause specialist, which is perfect for our conversation today. And welcome, Dr. Christina.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Well, I'm excited about this conversation. And the first thing I would love for you to share with our listeners is, what would you like these women to feel when they are finished listening to this episode?
So I would like them to understand what's going on. I always feel like my patients and clients, I think the difficult part is if you feel like you're being taken on a ride and you really don't know why it is and what's happening. So I want them to understand what's happening. And, there's so many steps you can do and not feel like no one gives me answers, but just to understand this chapter of their life. Which is, that's my important message. It's lovely post-menopause, really. It's just during this transition, things can get a little rocky because just our life, our midlife woman's life is usually kind of rocky and stressful. And that just adds to the whole process.
It really does. I'm excited to talk about that too, because there's so many facets. It's not just hormones, but I want to talk about you first. Before we get into this, what made you feel so compelled to work with women? And did you ever experience any of this yourself personally?
Of course. So first of all, women is just gynecology is the most beautiful certification, if you can ask me, because you have the endocrinology, you have the obstetrics, if you like that, you have surgery, you have urology, so you have everything. It's a little bit primary care. So it was always a no-brainer for me. And then, midlife, so once I started in practice, this was just the most fascinating thing. And I just felt I wasn't well prepared from residency. And I'm originally from the US, from Germany, ended up in the US really by accident. So anyhow, that's a different story. But I immediately got that certification in menopause medicine. And then, however, I always like to tell people the story. So, I was, since 15 years really specializing on menopause, but it was more the conventional approach, hormones and all of that and a lot of good data, but really no help. And then, when it came for me a little earlier than I expected, you think you're special. This is all going to come late for you. This is not what happened because I was a typical midlife woman. I'm stressed, I had a high profile job and did all kind of things. So, and then suddenly all these great answers I've been giving my patients, for a decade, I was like, well, that is really not good enough now because I'm angry, I was as menopausal rage, I had the GI issues, all the things, we were always like, yeah, it's okay, you're going to get through that, here maybe have some hormones. And now I was like, well, that's not good enough anymore. So that's when I, really then, grabbed that functional medicine armamentarium and then really, figured out what's going on with me and then figured out what's going on with all my patients and still keep figuring it out.
Yes. And I love how you get to the root cause because so many women are coming to me even saying, my doctor doesn't even know how to interpret my labs. I feel like everything's normal. Can we start there? Because most of my clients who come in, they also are not experiencing, we see so many memes and we see so much made fun of and talking about hot flashes. They're experiencing so many things, but then they go in and they get their blood drawn and everything looks great. And the doctor says, no, you don't need anything. You're fine. How do you help women through that?
Yeah, that's my favorite topic. So, and the thing is, I really know the conventional medicine and the functional medicine. So that I think helps my patients a lot because I can give them the answers from both sides and kind of pull it together. So, conventional medicine, we do a very limited set of labs, right? We do like a whole blood count and a metabolic panel and maybe some limited thyroid, maybe some lipids. And that can be indeed all within normal conventional ranges. So, and one thing is, conventional medicine, we use different lab cutoffs than functional medicine, where we are much stricter because in functional medicine, we look at optimal levels. Conventional, we don't want to make, the whole population sick. That would, cost money. So conventional medicine is great. I have nothing against it, but it avoids big morbidity or big sickness in big populations. So it's not really laid out to prevent or put you to optimal health. And this is how these lab parameters are. So that means a woman can have normal, she's not anemic and the thyroid looks okayish and the lipids are not so bad. Her average blood sugar is, not diabetic. So, but if she's pre-diabetic, people are like, yeah, it's not so bad. So that is one problem. So then in functional medicine, we look much closer at these things. And then also, however, do much more expanded panels and also then look how do these things relate. So there is some software we use in functional medicine that I really love. It's crazy what it gets out of regular blood work. Like it can tell if you're stressed, if you're acidotic, if you might have GI issues. So so that is that. And then the other thing is we are not looking at the right things, right? Again, very tunnel vision a little bit in conventional medicine. However, many of our symptoms in perimenopause have to do with the stress axis. They have to do with GI issues, right? So, and these women get a colonoscopy and that's all great because that's something we have to rule out, that there's no real disease. But then they get the diagnosis of, yes, that's IBS, right? And some people say like BS is the only thing that's real about that diagnosis because, and of course, my patients were like, well, why am I having suddenly IBS? And of course. So that's something not looked at. So I look at that, gut health tests, food sensitivities, and then it gets about, we have to check mitochondrial function. If someone is fatigued, can't sleep, no matter how much they rest, they can't get up in the morning. We are not just talking hormones or anything. In the end, all of these changes happening, and we're going to talk about what's happening, causes what we call like mitochondrial dysfunction. So these energy units are not working properly anymore. So I need to know that. Is it mitochondrial dysfunction where your fatigue is coming from? Is it oxidative stress, which in the end also causes mitochondrial dysfunction? So all that is important to know. Micronutrient deficiencies. People, they come with a bag of supplements and they're, really so then it's a B6 and maybe B12 and then vitamin D. So I call that this bag of random supplements, because it's the add-on stuff as they hear things on social media. But, rarely when I test them that's really what they're lacking. It lack the other B vitamins and CoQ10 and alpha lipoic acid. But how do we know what it is if you're not really testing? So that's important. And then I also always look at environmental toxins. So that is a big driver these days of many of these downstream effects. And if I don't know that, we can do all kinds of things and it might get a little better, but we haven't really found the real cause to actually then eliminate that. So that's just that. It's basically we are not looking under the right stone to really get these functional problems. The thing is, the labs say you are fine and we are fine and we are still functioning kind of because we're not just saying, no, I'm going on strike and that's it. And that's why we're kind of not looking deeper. But yes, there are actually answers.
That is so comprehensive. There's so much involved there. So let's park on the stress part of it because I do remember going in, cholesterol, triglycerides, A1C, everything's great, which is unusual that the A1C was okay because we know we'll get into the blood sugar also. But I want to park on stress for a minute because so many women also talk about the things that they're going through in midlife. So what are the things that women are dealing with? But then on top of that, how is stress affected by our midlife? And let's talk about if there is a hormone related to that, let's talk about that also.
Yeah. So stress, hits us very differently in midlife. And now I always want to clarify up front that stress, we always think stress, oh yeah, the work and the husband and the dogs and the kids. But no, that's just that. I'll call this the psychological and the circumstantial stress. What adds to stress in midlife is that hormonal up and down. Body even knows something is going on. Estrogen and progesterone, these great co-workers, they are supposed to come every day at 8 a.m. They do whatever they want. Mm-hmm. They come at 10, they come down 3 days in a row. They don't feel like it. So that cortisol level raises because of that reason. Then nutrient deficiencies actually causes stress. You're not going to believe that. It adds to the stress load. gut inflammation. So if we get this shift in the gut microbiome, it can, and then maybe inflammation sets in, adds to our inflammatory zone and stress load. And then environmental toxins. But the other thing that's really important, underfueling, over-exercising. And I always say there are roughly 3 different type of women in midlife. In my mind, they're the ones who really just need to start moving more, maybe adjusting their diet a little bit. That is easy, right? Maybe they're a little bit pre-diabetic. And then they're the ones who underfuel, right? Have learned since a long time to control their weight by cutting calories, eating very lean and healthy, and then they exercise a little more. And guess what? That's raising the cortisol level. Now they're chronically underfueling and over-exercising relatively, or some people are just need to build more muscles. And then the other category on the far other side are like these high-achieving sports girls, right? So the runners and the triathletes, and they do all kinds of things. And, they gain weight and they are barely eating enough and they're trying so hard. And that's the they can't even eat enough to really, balance out that stress load they put on their body. So, that is stress for you. So it comes in so many shades in perimenopause. And now what's happening once that cortisol is elevated? So it worsens first it worsens our insulin resistance. Together, with the estrogen. Estrogen drops, so that also helped our metabolic health. So now there are 2 heavy hitters that are affecting our blood glucose. That basically means insulin resistance when whatever you ate before gave you very slight blood sugar rise and then it went away. Now gives you really blood sugar roller coaster. And now this is bad for your waistline because that causes a high insulin release. And when insulin is around all the time, that then basically tells our body, do not carbohydrates you eat, please preferably store as fat. And second, if you actually exercise and don't eat enough, please don't break down fat, break down muscle. And this is when these women are scratching their head and they are like, well, I'm exercising, I'm barely eating, and I'm still having this belly and I kind of feel like I'm not building muscle. So it gets so complex, but it's, you can dig in there and understand every woman, what is her particularly, what is her situation? Does she need to scale down the exercise a little bit? Does she need to refuel? Which is a very difficult conversation to have because when you tell someone to actually eat more and they're, so that is so, yes. And then of course, once you have these blood sugar roller coasters, then you're going to get cravings because the moment that blood sugar was at the peak and now comes down, that's when you're hungry again. And this one, in the past, you might have thought, oh, my blood sugar gets low. Like, no, it's not low. It's just coming down from that peak. And that's when you have cravings. Then you want actually sugar or something to eat right after you've eaten, like an hour later. Or, after you've eaten, the typical blood sugar roller coaster sign is that you just want to I always say, put your head on the desk and sleep. That is when that blood sugar really, spikes up after you've eaten. So these are all these subtle signs. And, on top of this, again, you have that there's gut microbiome change just because the estrogen is moving up. And estrogen, has this buffering effect on our cortisol axis. So it keeps that, that our cortisol is not spiking up all the time. So that goes away. So now that stress that was enjoyed, being your job, you like some stimulation, suddenly it hits you differently. That's what women are saying, that stress, I just don't recover from it. Being it, the fight with your children or the stress at work, it just wants to make you cry suddenly. Or, is it that you just feel, hey, once I had a long run, I really need to recover from this like 3 days. And that's actually real. And then the other thing I want to mention is the estrogen and the serotonin link. That just comes all together in this wild pot of, potpourri of things that intermingle. So estrogen actually keeps our serotonin levels up. So serotonin, right, is this feel-good hormone. That's the hormone we try to keep up with many antidepressants we can prescribe. So now your estrogen goes on a roller coaster, goes from high up to low down. So that can, then what's raising serotonin is actually chocolate. So if you're craving chocolate, that's really to keep the serotonin level up. And, serotonin is like this Goldilocks. It's not like you want a lot or it's not like more is more. So if you have too much, it can give you anxiety. You're not enough. You feel like more sad and emotional. And all of us are a little different, hardwired, how sensitive we are to that, but that can add to it. And once the cortisol level goes up and down, because it's also going to spike if the blood sugar really drops, that's going to give us the typical cravings for sugar, so sweets and fat, sometimes also salt. So just so you know, that is indeed hardwired in our brain. This is like you being weak. This means there is something underlying that's really taking you on a ride.
Well, I'm so glad you said that because women are blaming themselves so much for these cravings that they're having when they are actually biological many times. And you brought up a few things that I want to come back to that were so golden. One of them is, by the way, you described to me when I was starting perimenopause, I was running marathons for about 20 years. I also grew up in diet culture where slim fast, snack well, fat free, all the cookies that had no fat in them but had extra sugar in them. We grew up that was the way that we were going to diet. We just eat less and count our calories. But I was depleted, and all of a sudden, I was becoming so depleted that not only was I probably doing exactly what you said, not filling myself with nutrients, not fueling enough, but I was also doing an exercise that was probably raising my cortisol quite a bit. So when we think stress is all about, you made such a beautiful connection too. We think stress is just about like our daily lives. And we used to be able to handle that. But then we're putting stress on the body, it sounds like, when we are not eating enough and not doing the type of exercise that we can recover from. So I'd love to stop there for a moment too. What is the exercise? I know everyone is different. You treat people like an individual. What would you love to see women doing exercise-wise?
Yeah. So I think, in midlife, I described this the rough 3 type of personalities there. There's many in between. So it really depends a little bit where you are. So, and I want to say for the people who exercise a lot, this is not like, I'm not saying you can never do that. It's just, this is a time to pause and reflect in midlife when you have to step back, look at it and say, well, a moment, I have to adjust a couple of things here. Because we all arrive, I call it like our health luggage, right? Our baggage we have, because the inflammation doesn't start, when you're in perimenopause or your gut issues. They're really just, these are women who have dragged this along for a while. It's just, that's the moment when that I always say like this rescue hormone, like estrogen, this fire extinguisher, who we have around for 30 years because it's trying to keep us going as we are reproducing, right? We don't want, nature wants us to have like kids. So which is really highly, very intense, producing every month an egg. So, and we don't want these women to have joint pains or, get sick. So estrogen helps. So now this goes away because nature says, hey, there's another half of your life. I want you to do something different. So now these, health luggage things, tend to come up. So what should we do? So best exercise. So first of all, you have to move. Okay. So it depends where you are. I have women, they just go to the gym every day. They lift weights for an hour and then they do cardio. Well, these are just like, you have to replace many of these cardio sessions with more yoga and then, strength training. Yes, we want strength training, but even that, some people just don't recover from that. They really overdo it. So I would say 3 times a week, some reasonable strength training. And then, if you do a lot of cardio already, do some yoga. Do this for a couple of weeks. It's actually science behind that. It's from athletes. So we can talk about that later. So they need to recover. They need to meet their, increase their energy availability to the body for the body to say, yes, I'm safe again. I'm going to maybe let you lose some weight once I feel actually safe again. So that's that. Then I think for everyone, people who haven't been moving at all or not much, start with walking. It's great for the brain. It's great cardiovascular exercise. So that is good one. The new thing I discovered is Nordic walking. You're going to find that's funny. This is like basically with ski sticks. And it's, it's not as bad for you. It's not bad for your joints at all, but it gets you from the exercise intensity between walking and running. So it's kind of really fun. And so again, it's like, I think that is a great one. And then, Yes, weight lifting. But again, if you're super exhausted, don't start with this. Or if you're super tired at night, finally at 10 p.m., you want to get your exercise in, rather go to bed. That is really more bang for your bucks. So, and for these middle people, a gentle combination, we want 2 to 3 times weightlifting, and the other days I would say move half an hour. This is ideal. I know it's difficult, I've been there, still there, sometimes, you think half an hour a day, that should be easy. But, asking me what is optimal, that would be great. And then for the over exercisers, try to scale down significantly. Sometimes I say, just try it for 2 weeks, because often it gives them so much anxiety. I just mention the word exercise less. So then I'm saying, just try, 2 weeks and see how you feel. See if your gut feels a little better. See if you sleep better. So, and then, sometimes it's just about doing one session less. I had one client, she was, I think, doing Peloton like 4 times a week. Finally, I could make her to actually stop for a while. And then she started 2 to 3 times a week. And she said, Dr. Ensman, I actually got better at it. They did like these assessment tests, like how much watt they can pedal. And she said, actually, she got better at it doing less. And then she said, I didn't realize how much that 4th session a week was really kicking my butt and not make me recover. So again, we are so into the thing we are doing, and we are getting so tight about it that we forget to step back and say, hey, let's just take a deep breather and let's see what's actually happening if I do a little less everywhere.
But isn't that the way women are? High functioning women, we have everything on a to-do list. So if we are supposed to work out 5 times a week, we have to check off 5 workouts. If we're supposed to do 3 miles that day, we do 3 miles. And it sounds like we're retraining our brain to listen to our bodies a little bit more. And again, you described me. I did have to back off of the running and start lifting, and I was lifting 5 days a week. I was that person that had to bring it back. And I actually progressed when I brought it back and just started walking. And walking, like you said, you mentioned something that I want to repeat for the listeners, that it's so good for your brain also, and processing, because emotional eaters need to process their emotions, and walking is one of the best ways to do that. And I love it. So what do you say to the woman who's on the opposite end, who is fatigued and feeling unmotivated? Because I remember even in perimenopause, there was a time when I just couldn't get off the couch. I sat on the couch. I saw my vacuum cleaner. I even plugged it in, but I could see the dog hair in the corner. I couldn't get off the couch to even do that. So what do you say to those women? What's going on, and what's their future look like if they start looking at this a little deeper?
Yeah. So first I wanted to say what walking is also doing, it actually lowers your cortisol level tremendously. So just say that's really good. So
Perfect.
women, that are just fatigued. So again, it depends a little bit what are the other, factors there. But we are saying the one who's just too tired to get up. I assume the one who's not really moving and not exercising. So here's what I would say. Again, I would kind of course, look at the I would start with some basic lab work and just see first, is the blood sugar contributing to that fatigue and nutrient deficiency and metabolic health decline? So that is, the first thing I would look at. However, if I have nothing else in my hand, I would get a B complex. So mostly we are really deficient in micronutrients. So I would say, hey, get a B complex multivitamin or B complex supplement, just to make sure we hopefully, covering all these B vitamins that are super important for energy and brain and mitochondrial health. And then magnesium glycinate at night or during the day is also super important for this brain function, mitochondrial. So these are kind of basics. There are many more, but I would say, let's do this. Then if, let's see, what she's just fatigued, circadian rhythm and sleep, right? So go back to the basics. So hydrate enough, then look at your circadian rhythm. I always assume people go to bed at night, but I know that's not the case, right? They go to bed whenever it's right. And then they're like, well, I go to bed at 2 a.m., but I still sleep, 6 hours or 8 hours. I'm like, that's great, but your circadian rhythm doesn't care. So really this growth hormone and the repair, all this only settles in if we actually go to bed prior to 11 p.m. And also only then we're actually going through these full sleep cycles, which are so important for circadian rhythm. So again, I would clean up these basics, make sure she gets up in the morning, maybe does a brief walk. If it's 5 or 10 minutes, fantastic. And then I would do some blood work, depending how bad it is. Here comes, the extensive micronutrient panel, good blood work. Check what her other symptoms are. If she has GI issues, it can be just gut inflammation that adds to it. But one other thing I would definitively check if she's eating enough. And that's a difficult conversation because they always assume they're eating enough. They just don't realize how much they are behind. So here I often then force them to actually use an app. It's called Chronometer. There are other ones out there, but once they realize, so first they're like, no, I don't want that, and then they realize how they're under fueling repeatedly, and then it slowly settles in. They understand. And then once we start, to say, hey, let's just try to 100 to 200 extra calories a day. And that's indeed when they're saying, I actually sleep better. So these are things you can do without basically any lab work. This is really just you checking really what are you eating. And these apps are easy these days. You can I have no relation with that app and all, just so you know. I just use it because it's really good. You can just make a picture these days from what you eat. And it calculates the macro and the micronutrients. It can, all your exercise and pulls in there. So I think understanding is always, and recognizing what's going on is always the first step. Because otherwise we can talk in theory and that woman just thinks that all that what I'm talking doesn't apply to her, unless she sees it actually.
Well, it's really interesting as someone who came from a very disordered eating past, and I have a lot of people who come to me, but of course we're all disordered if we grew up, eating in the 80s, 70s, and 90s. So the thing that's really interesting about tracking is I used to use it in the wrong direction. Because when we were younger, all we wanted to do was lose the weight, and we went only by calories, not by the nutrients and then macros. So when I used it to find out if I was eating enough, my app, and I just use MyFitnessPal just because it's easy. It's the same. Chronometer is also amazing, and neither of us are affiliated with them. We're just saying the ones that we use. But something that I noticed that it started doing was taking into account my activity and my exercise. So my calories are not always exactly the same. And I don't follow that, by the way. I follow it more by how I feel and how I sleep, exactly what you said. But I did find that there were certain times of the day that I really neglected myself. And I would love to hear your thoughts on some of the things that we don't necessarily want to prescribe a diet to people. Everyone's different, but maybe some things that you feel are really helpful. But also, like for someone like me, I was somehow thinking it was not okay to go, I felt like I had to eat something between 12 and 6, my lunch and my dinner, and then I'd feel guilty for that. When in actuality, every 3 hours I need food. That's just something I learned by tracking and knowing that. Otherwise, at 9 o'clock, I'm looking for the chocolate and the peanut butter. So what are your thoughts on women developing something that can help them get through the day? But you mentioned blood sugar and also keep their blood sugar stable throughout the day.
Blood sugar and cortisol. There are two things we have to keep in mind. So one, I know this intermittent fasting thing had its hype. That's what's really important here to know. I want to mention this first, like this extended fasting raises cortisol levels. So intermittent fasting is great. If you're younger, you're just insulin resistant, that's the only problem you're having, intermittent fasting, sure. However, for us who are stressed, that is going to have the opposite effect. And the other thing is what people started doing, they had the 6 or 8 hour eating windows, and that only works if you actually eat enough calories in this 8 hours. But that's what they didn't do either. So this is when that's really becoming a spiral. So that is that part. That's why I'm not a big fan of real, small eating windows in perimenopause. 12 hours, perfect. You go to bed at 7. You stop at 7 and then you eat again at 9 even, then you have 14 hours, reasonable. But everyone who has stress, and this is all of us, should really eat prior to 10 a.m., something like that, or within the first hour after getting up. So that's that. Then, this frequent small meals, that is really what mess probably many of our metabolisms up. So and there are two things. We actually want, in between you eating, we want this blood sugar to come down to the normal level and insulin come back down. That's really important for these insulin receptors to stay receptible for insulin, because every time when we eat, we want the sugar to be taken up in the cell, give us energy. So, however, if that cell sees insulin all the time because you snack every 2 hours, it's going to become insulin resistant. So that is kind of the concept behind it. So in order to reverse the insulin resistance, we really want these blood sugars. First, we are very strict in functional medicine. We want them to stay less than 110 for at least 4 weeks. But the other thing is we want you not to eat in between your meals, about minimum 3 hours, better 4 to 5. However, we don't want you then to starve from one meal to the next, because I'm stressed, I want to eat, and I need an afternoon snack. So that's information. But the important thing is then you need to eat more during, when basically have a satisfying meal, whenever you eat, make sure you have enough calories so it's carrying you more or less easily to your next meal. And then, of course, at night, don't eat late, but eat enough that you're not getting the munchies at 9 or 10 p.m. because I can't sleep when I'm hungry, So yes. And sometimes, we realize, something happened and then I need to snack something. So that is really, there come lots of pieces with it. And what else to do to stabilize the blood sugars? Here is really important to have, not a lot of carbohydrates in the morning, but more protein. And here's the protein piece. I know it's a big hype right now and protein is important, but I'm always afraid if we say protein, it's going to outcrowd the fiber and the greens and the veggies, which we really need. So, and then I always say, then remember, there is a lot of protein in veggies, in your seeds, in your nuts, even, asparagus has a tremendous amount of protein compared to its weight. You get, protein in broccoli, you're not going to believe it. So I'm always saying, don't think I have to eat now animal protein 3 times a day, which is fine animal protein, but everything in its right amount. But we were talking about how to stabilize your blood sugar. So in the morning, have protein. And I made this little X course because I wanted to let you know, it's not about having eggs every morning or a processed, protein shake. You can have, we like non-dairy stuff in functional medicine, but so non-dairy yogurt has great protein. Put your chia seeds in there, flax seeds, basil seeds, nuts. So all that has a great amount of protein. So that would be a good one. And then, for lunch and dinner. So dinner is actually the one, if you have problems sleeping, that is the moment you might want to have a little bit extra carbohydrates. Depending again, who you are, where you are, does it spike your blood sugar? But that's really going to be helpful overnight. It also helps to slow down the cortisol. And, a lunch, eat what you need, because that's when you're active. And women, often think that when they, skip meals, they kind of save calories. Not our midlife metabolism doesn't care for that. It's just going to turn off the oven and hold on to every gram of fat you have. So you can really only overcome that by feeding the body enough fuel, basically increasing that energy availability, basically that energy you still have left after you have, fed your body, did your basic metabolic requirements. Only if that you have enough for extra things for a while. That's when that, the body is stabilizing in all systems, from the thyroid to your gut, because we also know if you cut carbohydrates, you're just creating microbiome that's more efficient in extracting calories out of your food like we don't. So again, it's all about giving your body enough for several weeks. And that's when people have this weight loss plateau and, that is really feeding the body enough. There's going to be some weight increase initially. And then you can kind of try to, to decrease calories gently for like 2 weeks and then restart. It's really important. We call it's basically the way to avoid this adaptive thermogenesis. There's one thing I want to mention because it hasn't really come up yet. So when we keep cutting calories all our life, less and less and less, our basic metabolic rate adjusts to that every time. So, and this is why in the end, once you're in your 50s, you're barely eating anything. But if I cut just a little bit more in the past, when I was 35, I would lose weight. It's not going to work anymore because you already cut so much and the body is just adjusting. So then even when you exercise, your body is going to break down muscle. It's like, no, I need to hold on to all of this because that person is not eating enough for what I really need. So, and the only way out of that is really to increase that basic metabolic rate again, which goes by eating more and then also moving, again, depending where you are. They're the ones who don't need to move more, but the ones who, like me, sitting on my, rear end a lot, I had to increase my exercise. So that's how, you get out of there. But it needs some guidance because you are not all the same. There are a lot of variations. Some women have to deal with a lot of gut issues, gut inflammation. If that is going on, then your body has oxidative stress. And that's also something it doesn't want to let go of, of fat. Or you have maybe an environmental toxin burden that you have no idea happened. And then, that is, we often say in functional medicine, the body is holding on to that fat because there are things stored in there. So again, that needs very gentle teasing to make this body feel safe again, make sure it can drain and detox these things. So it's complex, but we do understand it. It's not like it's, the primary care physician is probably not going to have that depth of knowledge. But you are not like in a spot where no one can help you. We do understand these things better and better.
I love too that you mentioned bringing the calories up before we bring them down because in personal training, they call that reverse dieting. And there's a reason why they do that because the body doesn't feel safe. We've been doing this for a long time to our bodies. We've been decreasing. We're only getting bigger around the middle. It's like having an inner tube around the middle. And I also wanted to talk to you about the weight loss, that all women come in and all they want is weight loss. And I'm hearing you say that really we need to have that metabolic health before we can have the weight loss, because weight loss is just weight loss. It doesn't mean we're going to be healthy and sustain it. So in your words, can you describe what metabolic health means to you?
Yeah, so metabolic health first means that we are in an anabolic state here. So that means our body, if we feed it well, it's willing to build muscle, right? It's like, yes, I take this. We arrive kind of all of us like in a catabolic state of midlife. We have been dieting, we're not eating enough. So our body just breaks down muscle and it's not going to build muscle regardless how much we exercise, and it's building fat. And when we lose weight, we are losing muscle 40%. And the other, and the problem is we're not going to rebuild that easily once we are midlife. And apart, after age 30, there's a certain amount of muscle we lose anyway, unless we are not really working on it. So we are arriving again in midlife, with already the odds stacked against us. So we have lost muscle. We are, for that reason, already metabolically not so resilient anymore. So for me, metabolic health means I can eat and the body is going to, build that as muscle. Give me muscle, give me energy. And we are not going to have, big blood sugar spikes. It remains stable, and muscle helps, as you probably all know, because it's like a big metabolic organ. It's gobble up all the sugar. Then you can have your dessert every now and then because it's going to be like, oh, no problem. I'm going to use that up right here. So I think that is really metabolic health, and that we feel energized, from what we eat, not fatigued. And that metabolic health, you're then going to see in your lipid panel, right? So that is where, in the end, that's also going to improve. So yes. And I think that muscle loss, that is, is a big problem and when we always think about weight loss, we are forgetting how much muscle, we lose. And, I'm now 54. And I'm looking back at pictures when I was like at my thinnest, like in my early 40s. And now, we have this skewed vision of us. So now I'm looking at this person on pictures and I'm like, well, she is thin, but she doesn't look healthy. But that, and again, I wasn't the runner, but I was moving, I realized this was not a metabolic healthy person. And I know I was tired during that age, so it's interesting, but I know I was so proud to fit in these clothes. And I'm like, what was wrong with us? And now, I weigh a little more, but I have a completely different body type. I don't fit in my blazers anymore because my back got, my shoulders. And first I was like, it was weird. But then I was like, well, let these darn blazers go. They're, why? I'm 5'10". Why do I need to fit in a numbers small blazer I was stupid to start out with? So, and now I feel, strong, and I'm getting easy up my stairs, and it's weird. So, to your point, I think we are just so weirdly wired and trained through society that we want to be this thin rag and don't understand how good you're going to feel. And, once you actually have filled things out with muscle. So
That's beautiful, though. And I think that's a lot of women's experience with the thinness until they recognize when they actually have been building the muscle, which, this endocrine organ that we didn't realize is gold for also the rest of our lives. And I'm the same way. I'm going to be 60 in a couple weeks. And I am telling you, like, I feel better now sometimes than I did at the height of running in my 30s. I wasn't eating enough food. I also just wasn't stress managing at all. I literally just took every day as it came, and perimenopause hit me hard. But this also reminds me of a question that I have for women who think that they are now exempt from all of this because they've had a hysterectomy or they're postmenopausal. And how can we share with them this still applies?
Yeah. Okay. Well, there are two different, scenarios. You had a hysterectomy, but you still have your ovaries. You're going to do the same than all of us. It's just you're not going to have that menstrual cycle to remind you what's going on. So yes, so that is just that. And if you had a oophorectomy, for removal of the ovaries with the uterus for some, time earlier, now it depends. So let's say you were 30 and had it all removed. I hope you had been on hormone replacement therapy. Then, you're not going to go through these hormonal ups and downs. Most likely this all happened earlier, closer to that time of surgery, because we give you hormones back and it avoids many of these changes. However, it's a much lower hormone level than what you do when you have your up and downs. So, and then there come just this midlife changes. So I don't think it's so different. It might just happen a little earlier for these women. However, we do that HRT for women who go surgically into early menopause is actually protecting many of the metabolic effects. So, and for the one who still have the ovaries, same thing. It's going to be around 50 most likely, sometimes a little earlier, because these ovaries, even we don't remove them, they have a blood supply coming partially from the uterus. So depending how much your ovaries are getting from that uterus, that might be impaired. So sometimes these women go a little bit earlier into menopause. But, again, I'm not pushing hormones on anyone. I'm just saying this is the data we have. And if you were 35 and had no hormones because, let's say, you had cancer and couldn't do hormones, you will have these metabolic changes happen exactly right after that. Yes.
Yes. And I know that's a very personal choice, and especially if women have had cancer. I just feel bad for women like my mom who were so scared by the original research, and we know that whole story and how that played out. But I'm so thankful because my brain and body are so much better than they could be. But I appreciate this conversation today because we've had a lot of conversations about hormones. And I think we're all realizing it's so much more than we really focus on that. And it's funny how you said even also online, we're just focusing so much on the protein, but we're not necessarily also focusing on that lovely fiber that we need. But I want to veer into a very personal topic for me too, but because also my listeners who've been with me for a long time know that I gave up alcohol about 4.5 years ago. And my body, for so many reasons though, there were so many reasons that I gave it up. It wasn't just the menopausal journey. It wasn't that I couldn't metabolize it well. My vibrational level, everything was just not in the right place. And it was contributing greatly, I believe, to my cortisol issues. So I'd love to know your thoughts on, because midlife women are going through this and alcohol always comes up in our sessions. What are your thoughts on alcohol?
Yeah. So alcohol, has several hits we get from it. And I'm not saying I'm not a strict anti-alcoholic. You just need to know.
And we're not judging, by the way.
Yeah. Well, need to know what it does to you. So first of all, it impairs estrogen metabolism, so in perimenopause. So it really can add to what we call estrogen dominant symptoms, right? It can make your PMS, PMDD worse. It can make your bleeding worse if you're so, wired genetically. It can give you breast tenderness. So be aware of that. And our liver with this detox and perimenopause also already struggles a little bit. So that alcohol is kind of, some gasoline on the fire. Then it does raise our cortisol levels indeed. So it takes a while to get metabolized. And then there are these actually neurotoxic compounds when we metabolize alcohol that occur. It always happens. However, usually we just deal with it. But now we're becoming so sensitive and they are brain toxic. So this adds to it. And then, this elevated cortisol level actually causes hot flashes. So I have a glass of wine at night. I know I'm going to have a hot flash at night. And I tell my patient, well, if you have your glass of wine at night, hopefully every now and then don't complain to me that you have a hot flash and you need to increase your hormones. I'm like, no, this is you got from your wine. And, enjoy just so you know this is most likely going to happen. So, and we get this cortisol up and down and also blood sugar instability. So many women give up the alcohol. And, then of course, once that cortisol is turned on and, your insulin resistant gets worse with that alcohol too. So it adds to that fire we are already having. And then the part that many women are just having, it gives them they recover such harder from the alcohol. That's me, I'm like I'm a cheap date. Really give me half a glass of wine and that's all what I need and want. Because the next day, it's not worth it anymore. So again, if you want to have, every now and then, please, because if we are social and we have a good time, that's also important. But just be aware that it's not really doing you any major good in bigger amounts. And there is no amount of red wine you can drink that you really get a meaningful amount of resveratrol. Okay. So that is just also not a thing. Yeah, so that is my take on the alcohol.
Thank you. I did all of it. I even went to tequila and all these other things, even though I loved wine. I tried all the things in the name of having lower sugar. Yeah. But the alcohol is the alcohol, and I just could not handle it. I appreciate your take on it and your very non-judgmental way of dealing with it. And also mentioning in there, that social connection is really important too. We need that. So, Dr. Christina, what have I missed today, or what would you like to share as we're closing out today with the listeners?
I think most important that this postmenopause is a fantastic time. So I always tell people, look, before, you never know what the hormones were doing with you. You woke up this way or other way, the next, you would snap at people, you would, well, hormonal, not a thing anymore. I'm waking up every day the same Christina. It's fantastic. I really love that. So it's a good time for us, really. And then, however, start early recognizing your stressors in midlife. Start with that mind shift. Start to look forward to something, but just be aware, hey, I have to prepare for this a little bit. Make sure I'm, stabilizing my blood sugars. And there are plenty of books out there, so we don't have to get in that. Really, metabolic health is really the base of everything. And then, so the blood sugar, and then comes the gut health. And that's when we often say, hey, what might be one important thing, have a big glass of water in the morning, start chewing properly, eat slowly, and get a good night's rest. This is really where basics for gut healing, really help. And if there are stressors in your life that, have to go, have a look, you might have to make adjustments. If this is, I had to separate from my husband. It wasn't good for me. Okay. So that wasn't easy. No, I changed my jobs twice in the last 2 years. And now I have, my own business. That was just understanding I can't do this anymore, or I don't want to do it anymore. And that the other thing I want to encourage people. So postmenopause is like you get this BS detector plugged on you. So we are just not going to be very good with any nonsense in our life anymore. And hey, I think it's fantastic, but just be aware you're going to go through some things when you just have to realize I have to do some things differently from now on. But it's going to be cool. Don't you think so, Kim? Don't you love your life?
I think it's amazing. My life is so much more calm and better, just like you said. And everything that you mentioned is not only amazing for our health, But for the emotional eaters who are listening, all of those things lead to rewiring the brain, calming the body, calming the nervous system. And you are empowering women to take control of their health and get things checked out. And to also be able to, I love it, get rid of the things that are not serving you anymore. So thank you so much, Dr. Christina. Where can our listeners find you?
Yeah, I have a website. That's the easiest, drchristinaensman.com. There's always, just contact me there, write me an email. Yep, that's that.
Great. We're going to make sure that's in the show notes. And I'll also put your social media in there also so people can follow you because you have some really good posts. Dr. Christina, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Kim. And thanks to all your listeners. I always love these conversations. It's fun.
Thank you. And to the listeners, nourish your entire life and give yourself grace today.